Joining us right now, we're pleased to say, is the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Jason Miyares. Mr. Attorney General, good to have you back on the show, sir.
Great to be with you, Vince. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. You know, I know this is an issue that's of concern to you. One of the things we've been talking a lot about on our air is all of the problems going on in Northern Virginia, including the fact that a registered sex offender by the name of Richard Cox has apparently gone into multiple facilities, including a local high school, and been exposing himself to women under the guise that he, too, is a woman. He, of course, shouldn't even be there as a registered sex offender. You are very concerned about this story, and you're trying to get to the bottom of it. What are you up to?
Well, I mean, what we have found and from the public reporting is that this perpetrator was allegedly in June of 2024 was at a Planet Fitness exposing himself in women's locker rooms. And essentially, the best we could tell from both the court record and public reporting is that the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office had decided to essentially dismiss the charge, not even counting the fact that where the Planet Fitness was located was directly next to a child play and learning center. This perpetrator was already a Tier 3 sex offender, and they're prohibited from any type of extended presence within 100 feet of a child day program. It seems like this was potentially ignored. And as a result, because no action was taken this summer against this alleged perpetrator, we've had these charges that filed against him in November of actions in November of multiple high schools in which he would expose himself to children and women. And so this goes back to what I have said. You have these social justice prosecutors that view themselves as social workers and not prosecutors. It's this criminal first, victim last mindset that has so permeated so many tragically in today's Democratic Party. And so essentially we sent them a very public letter saying, if you're not willing to act, if you're not willing to do something, our office will. We have very capable prosecutors in the criminal division and the Attorney General's office, and we're basically demanding that he transfer his case to our office. My hope is he won't refuse that request, but this goes back to something that Governor Youngkin and I have been pushing for quite some time, because we've seen so many of these left-wing social justice prosecutors, is an AG expansion bill in which I have about a dozen areas of the law that I have original jurisdiction to prosecute. In a normal world, in a healthy environment, I'm able to work with the Commonwealth's attorney. They can't handle a case, or there's a conflict, or there's a certain level of sophistication they can't handle. They turn it over to our office. In this case, they just decide to not prosecute categories. And when a prosecutor decides that they're not going to act, victims don't get a second chance. And my attitude is victims deserve a second chance. They deserve to have their voice heard, and that's why the AG's office wants to be able to be that voice for those victims that so often feel like they've been left behind.
But the way the law is structured, as the Attorney General of the Commonwealth, it sounds like you are reliant on these prosecutors, this U.S. attorney, the Commonwealth's attorney in Fairfax County, in this case, Steve Descano. You've got to ask him to hand you control of this case, and then he has to grant it. That's the way this is structured?
Right. So certain areas of the criminal code I'm able to prosecute with or without anyone's permission. I mean, child pornography is an example. Other sections of the code, that is under the original purview of the Commonwealth's attorney, and then they ask for, and this happens all the time. I have a great relationship with so many of our prosecutors around the state. We've been second chair in a cop killer case in Southwest Virginia where, they ask for us to come in, they ask for assistance, or they have a conflict, or they just have a capacity issue where, they maybe have a more rural jurisdiction, only have maybe 2 or 3 prosecutors in their entire office, and they need help. We come in all the time. And so unless I have original jurisdiction or they're asked, I'm not allowed to just step in. And so we've essentially said, listen, if you're not willing to do your job and you clearly don't want to be a prosecutor, you want to be a social worker, then why don't you turn it over to people that actually believe in prosecuting to the fullest extent of the law?
Yes, but are there any other options? So if he just refuses you, what does that mean for Fairfax? That it's just lawless?
It's just lawlessness. And this is exactly why the last several years we've had a bill that would expand my authority for exactly cases like this where a local prosecutor is simply refusing and is not doing, crimes against children, things of that nature, that we can go in and we can go ahead and prosecute when a local prosecutor refuses to do so. So It's a bill that keeps dying on a party line vote in the General Assembly. We're seeing that yet again when prosecutors, left-wing prosecutors, are refusing to do their job. I'm ready and willing and able to step in, and so we're asking for that authority to allow us to do it with or without their permission. But in certain areas of the law, we have to get their permission first.
How unusual is this? Do other states handle it the same way, or is Virginia unusually restrictive when it comes to your ability to step in?
No, believe it or not, there's some states where the Attorney General's office has no criminal division whatsoever. Believe it or not, our criminal division in the AG's office is the largest division we have in the Attorney General's office. I'd say we're probably medium. I mean, some states, the AG has pretty broad authority over their local district attorneys. We obviously call them Commonwealth attorneys here in Virginia. That's not something I have right now. But the level of frustration that I heard from so many victims, particularly in Fairfax, and these other areas that have had left-wing prosecutors, it's really heartbreaking because, Vince, if you talk to these victims, the one thing they are so paranoid is they just don't want to be a statistic, right? They don't want to be one more person that is just one more number. Yes. Right. They have something that has happened in their life that has been traumatic. It's turned their life in some cases upside down, and they don't just want to be another number in the court system. And when things like this happen, when somebody was brave enough to file a complaint and call the police, and then they're essentially told, you know what, this case isn't moving forward because the prosecutor isn't going to prosecute it, that's just heartbreaking. And yes. The number of times I heard from victims, I had a roundtable with just victims from Fairfax. We had so many people wanting to come see me. We had to move the meeting to the Library of Virginia. That's how many victims wanted to come talk to me. They were overwhelmingly from Fairfax, and it was story after story of him either dismissing charges, doing the bare minimum, anything with a mandatory minimum, getting rid of. Obviously met with a family where the child was 5 years old, had been raped over the course of a year. Horrific. This perpetrator was eligible for a life sentence, and Descano reduced the charge. He wouldn't be eligible for a possible life sentence. It was case after case that you see that, and so many residents are so upset of that. And you talk to retailers as well. I mean, he won't prosecute petty larceny crimes, anything $1,500 or less. We won't prosecute it because it's technically a misdemeanor where you've essentially legalized theft. So I've heard from so many shop owners that are frustrated of what's happened with the larceny and the shoplifting that's happening. And those are all passed on to consumers, as you know. So it's a real problem we've been trying to fix. And so sometimes the only thing you could do is just call somebody out publicly.
Has he responded to you in any way?
Last I checked, he had not. He had not responded. So maybe he made some statement on social media, but let's just say my hopes of this are low because I think, Thomas More said it's never too late to do the right thing, but I don't have much confidence in Descano's ability to see that on this situation.
I don't know. I mean, I assume based on everything you're saying that you consider this guy to be a public menace. This is a very dangerous person to be in a position of power where he's allowing all of this to happen to the residents of his own community.
Well, it's a dereliction of duty. He's taken an oath of office to be the prosecutor. I mean, the sad thing is when you hear these interviews with these type of social justice prosecutors, they walk into a courtroom and they actually see two victims. They see the victim of the crime, but they see the defendant as a victim themselves, as a victim of, quote unquote, the system or the victim of society. And so they don't really have that mindset that you should have, which is you're the voice for the victim. You're the voice for the Commonwealth. Your job is to prosecute and prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. Obviously, the defendant has his own protection. He has his own defense attorney. The burden is on the prosecution to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. It becomes really distorted when the prosecutor seems to be over and over again having more sympathy for the defendant than for the victims. That becomes a real problem. And we've seen it really impact the quality of life in a community. When that happens, I like to say nobody should be looking over their shoulder in fear in Virginia, but you see that happens. People are they look over their shoulder in fear when local prosecutors don't do their constitutional mandated duty.
We're talking to the Attorney General of Virginia, Jason Miyares. I want to ask you about a different issue in Virginia this week. The President of the United States signed an executive order forbidding men from playing women's sports and vice versa, and saying that your federal funding will be on the line if you continue to allow that to occur. And at first, the Virginia High School League seemed like it was an open rebellion against this, saying that they would continue to allow boys to play girls' sports. I saw then subsequently that they reversed that decision and have surrendered to common sense here. They say that now that boys will only play boys' sports and girls will only play girls' sports. There's also the Virginia Independent Schools Athletic Association who came out and said the same exact thing. Why was there resistance to this in the first place, and what's going on inside the Virginia school system?
Well, common sense is very common these days, and the fact that we're having this debate, if I was to tell you 10 or 15 years ago that the major party platform, the Democratic Party of Virginia and nationally, was that biological men should be in women's locker rooms and on sports teams, you probably would have laughed at me. But this is where we are, and so they really, really pushed this kind of far left social agenda that was something that was unquestioned for decades, hundreds, if not thousands of years. And suddenly they're pushing this. And so now I think the main thing they're seeing is their legal exposure is massive. You saw the female athletes on the University of Pennsylvania swim team have filed a lawsuit now against UPenn. I mean, think about just basic Title IX sexual harassment, hostile work environment. Think about suddenly these are women walking into a locker room with no warning, seeing a biological male walk around naked in their bathroom. I remember meeting with one of the UPenn swimmers who said she was so humiliated with no warning that she felt like she had to go into the janitor's closet to change into her swim gear. Same thing happened at the University of Roanoke with the women's swim team that had no warning either. And so I think as a result, they have read the tea leaves and seen some of the legal liability, legal exposure. It's sad that it's gotten to that point. You know, I like to say sometimes you could be so open-minded, your brain falls out. And I think that's what happened for certain people that should know better, that should have been, their priority should have been protecting women and protecting women's sports, and they should have known better. But they adopted this kind of left-wing ideology in which they thought that they were shown they were being open-minded and progressive by allowing biological males in these sports teams and in these locker rooms. And so now I think they've blessedly seen the light. I'm grateful for that, but I think it's really, really telling, and that's where we ended up.
Is there a lesson in here for places like Fairfax County, Virginia, in the sense that, like, you know, President Trump, some of his other executive orders have included forbidding racial bigotry inside of these schools, as well as this radical gender ideology, teaching kids that they were born in the wrong body. He says you can't do that anymore or else you're going to lose your federal funding. Fairfax in particular, they take $50 million a year in federal funds. You know, do you have a message for these school systems who are basically in open defiance against the president's EO right now?
Well, I think at our core, we should be teaching our kids to love each other, not divide each other. And I think the very, very best of America is this ability to recognize that we're all created in the image of God. We all have amazing value, but we're not going to just define who we are solely by our race or our sex.
Right.
And that's exactly the type of colorblind society that we all should strive to achieve. That should be what they should be teaching. And I think they'd be wise. And like anything else, they need to also recognize possible legal exposure as this from lawsuits. And I'll give you an example. There's a lot of schools in Northern Virginia have some pretty horrific cases of anti-Semitism that has emerged above on the surface. And, and DEI, what has happened at some of these schools is they've used DEI as a vehicle to really, I would argue, make some of their Jewish students not feel safe, particularly since October 7th after the horrific attack in Israel. It's been really disturbing to hear what has happened as it's bubbled on the surface. And so the schools need to be mindful of that and look to seek an environment where every student, no matter what their background now, can go and learn and focus on what it is to be a good citizen, which means don't judge your fellow citizen by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I know that should be redundant in modern day America, but the idea that we have to repeat that and remind school districts of that is a difficult thing.
Yeah, and a sign of how chaotic things have become.
Yeah.
Attorney General Jason Miyares, Commonwealth of Virginia. Sir, thank you as always. Good to talk to you today.